Hi everyone, good morning, and welcome to our chat about whether we trustees should be paid or not. And I know there are lots of very different opinions on this, and actually being at the SCVO trustee conference on Tuesday this week, it was a big theme there as well. So I know it's something that we're asked about a lot at Aspen when we're recruited into those kind of roles, and also when we're working with trustees as well to recruit other types of roles. The conversation kind of turns to, if we paid trustees, would we get better people? What does that mean for the charity? Can charities afford that? Does Will that introduce more diversity? I mean, the list of questions goes on and on and on. And it's something that I think is really important. So when I saw Karen Moore here had posted on LinkedIn, and we were catching up anyway, I kind of thought, why don't we just do a bit of a chat around it, and see what people want to say about it, and also what I think is a lot of people maybe haven't thought about both pros and cons of if trustees should be paid or not. So we'll come to all of those that in a minute. But please do in the chat if there's questions all the way through the panel presentations or at the end, please put those all the way through and I'll pick those up and take them out to the panel, and hopefully get you all the answers here because we've got such amazing people with us today. I'm pretty sure they'll be able to answer everything for you. There'll be nothing left unanswered. Also, I should say this is being recorded, so if there's you can just take yourself off screen and all that kind of stuff. But we'll send it out once everything's finalised. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Karen Moore to introduce herself and give a little bit of her thoughts on whether trustees should be paid or not.
Hi there. I'm Karen, and I work now as an interim executive, and I've been doing that since 2018. So I go into charities where they don't necessarily have a current leader in the organisation, and I help with any changes going on in the organisation for good or for bad. And I do a lot of change work, turnaround work, and I specialise in that change and turnaround at the moment. It can be cultural or it could be financial. So that's kind of the area that I specialise in at the moment. And I've been doing that since 2018. Before that, I was a substantive CEO for 6 years and a director for 10 years of an organisation based in Falkirk. So that was Scottish Waterways Trust and the Waterways Trust. I disaggregated the Scottish Waterways Trust and led its separation. So that's me, that's my background. And in terms of this, well, I'm not expecting it to be an easy conversation. I know it's got its challenges, and people have quite deeply held views and assumptions on how the charity sector operates around boards and board members and trustees. But the sector is changing, and it's changing quite fast, and it's quite complex. And the communities we serve are very different. And when I decided to write this article, it was not that I had a particular view in mind as to whether we should pay trustees, but I do think what's important is that we think about all options and that we raise topics that sometimes remain hidden and off the table and not discussed openly. And I like to be a bit of a disruptor. I've always been a bit of a disruptor, probably since the age of 5. So that's my natural state, is I like to ask questions. I'm curious. And I like to put things out there. If something comes into my head, I know that from working in organizations as an interim, I see it quite a lot. That some organizations do very well in board recruitment and others really struggle. And sometimes I think, is it to do with the organization? Is it to do with the recruitment campaign? Or is it to do with something else? Is it something else we're missing? Would it help if we paid trustees? Or is that something that is just a misnomer? or would it actually attract those community-based trustees that we're really looking for, that we need around the table, that maybe can't afford to come and be a board member, and that we would get that diversity that we were looking for on our board of trustees, if we could afford to pay them. So I just thought I would pop an article about that and see what others think and get other people's points of view, because I love getting other people's points of view. And so I have gone out to some of my clients. Some of those don't pay, some others do pay. So I've got some thoughts from organisations who do pay, so I can bring that to the table today. And I also would love to hear from organisations out there of, have you thought about paying your trustees? Are there any barriers to that, in your constitutions or from funders? Have funders said to you that you can't pay? And what are those barriers? Are there any other barriers? Barriers from other stakeholders or barriers from your communities? What would they think? Is there reputational damage there? So I'm just really interested in this as a topic. So that's why I decided to put this as an article on LinkedIn. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Karen. John, let's come over to you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and giving us what your thoughts are on if we should pay trustees or not.
Thank you, Debbie. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation, and Karen, thank you for starting us off. There's right away that the questions that you posed have got me thinking. So I'm John Ryan. In my day job, I am Director of Service, as you can see in the background here, a children's organisation called St Mary's Kenmure. And I've been here for approximately 18 months. My trade, as it were, is a social worker, and I've been working in social work services for approximately 40 years now, specifically around the regulation of care services and also the provision of care homes for children and young people. And I suppose that through all those years, I fundamentally believe that residential care can be a really, really positive experience for children in Scotland, a place for children to thrive and grow. And some of the work that I've been really, really privileged to lead on nationally is testament to that determination that what we do is for the good of children and indeed the good of the workforce. I've held trustee roles since 2014. And I suppose when I think back to the first experience, and those roles have always been on a voluntary basis, but thinking about the very, very first trustee role and thinking perhaps about some of the barriers as whether or not potential trustees believe that what they've got in their bag, as it were, is going to be of a credible offer to the organisation. So the first organisation that I was a trustee for was called together the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights, and I really, really, I can still remember the first board meetings and as a social worker sitting in a room with lawyers feeling quite overwhelmed, or, is what I'm going to offer going to have any currency? But really, really quickly learned that what I was able to bring into those conversations was the reality of policy and what it meant every day for children. And together, trustees weren't paid, albeit trustees could receive expenses for travel, etc. In 2020, I became a trustee of an organisation called Covey in Lanarkshire. It's a fantastic organisation, and again, and I've held various roles in there. I'm currently vice chair, but the organisation doesn't pay trustees. And I suppose as you were speaking, Cam, one of the real challenges that we've faced in COVID and that organisations can face is the recruitment of trustees at the moment. So the question about would payment actually change the game, because that there's absolutely correct to say that third sector organisations, or how we describe charities, has changed, and there's a real need. As we know, it's a very, very volatile and challenging environment, so that trying to maintain the organisation's charitable purposes but being far more business-like is a real challenge. So, payment to attract skills and recognition of the responsibility, because I suppose that's one of the things that we really need to consider. Trustees, through the Articles of Association and legally, carry a lot of responsibility for governance. And when I'm thinking about in COVID, but the trustees that we have around us here in St Mary's, they've got the ultimate safeguarding responsibilities for the children that we look after. So that's a huge level of responsibility. So also, what we want to be able to consider as well within the payment questions, whether or not it would allow organisations to retain talent as well, and thinking about the M&Rs that you referred to, are those agile enough to make sure we retain talent? But I think for me that I've seen, for me that my view is that being a trustee is something that for me that allows me to give something back to the communities, and being involved in COVID. I live in Lanarkshire, and being part of a charity in Lanarkshire is a really, really good opportunity to do that. And I was going to say spare time, but maybe not necessarily spare time, and the time that I have. And actually, I suppose that as we're talking today, it makes me think about what's the purpose of working in the third sector. We use the terms third sector and voluntary organisations and charities quite interchangeably, and does that create a mindset? So I suppose that, so if you look at our accounts, we're a £8-9 million organisation. People, that's a business, and it needs to be run. So we need to think quite differently. So we're really, really privileged here in St Mary's, and indeed in Covey, that we've got a range of skill that has transformed how the organisations work, and that's all been done on a voluntary basis without pay. So I suppose at this stage, my view would be that trustees shouldn't be paid, but I do recognise that there are real benefits in being able to attract people, and also recognising that that some people might not have the time, as it were, within their day. So payment might actually be a way to allow them to be part of a third sector or charity. So that's me, Debbie.
John, thanks very much. Lindsay, let's come to you next.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic to listen to the other panellists, and I will only want to try and add to the really excellent points and questions that have been made already. So my organisation is Apex Scotland. We're a national justice organisation that supports people to build a future beyond their past. And while we very much value the work that our board does, I also sit on trustee boards and voluntary committees as well. And I sit on the board for Charity Leadership Scotland, and also a voluntary member of the Fair Work Edinburgh Committee. And these are all really important things that goes back to the heart of the act of service that John spoke about. And I think that's one of the points I wanted to raise today, was really the origins of where trustees and the point of the sector came from, was that act of service, to want to do service for our community, to make sure that things that were wrong were righted, and support that needed to be given was given, and not necessarily in the traditional ways that a business would have achieved those solutions. But I think the topic of trustee pay is not one to look at in isolation of the wider issue and the wider challenges that the charity sector has. That act of service, which is many of the reasons that we all join charities and want to work for charities, is also in conflict with itself at times, because of where charities and the expectations of how they run and what they should do, how that's changed since the origins of that real call to action ethos that sits behind the sector. We have a really uncomfortable relationship with the issues of profit for good and with pay. There are big problems about how uncomfortable we are to talk about that. We're expected to create surplus, but we can't talk about that in profit, to talk about that to reinvest into the goodness of our people and the goodness of the value of what we do in our communities. We don't want to talk about the fact that we're paid. The voluntary sector label in itself creates that illusion, but I think it's really important to highlight that actually only 31% of charities in Scotland, according to Oscar, are actually staffed organisations. That creates a huge number of charities out there that are entirely staffed with volunteers, with people doing good service. It's really important to keep that context of what's actually happening in Scotland. And when I heard that last year at the gathering from Oscar, it kind of actually blew my socks off a bit. I thought, actually, my issues are really a little bit different. And actually, that's why the public probably have a different understanding and expectation of what is pay and why should people who work in charities be paid. We have huge expectations of our boards. We ask an enormous amount of them. The liabilities that trustees carry are significant, and they are a unique subset of volunteers in our sector that really do face quite enormous challenges and expectations of them. I can understand why pay does get brought up. It's a really challenging market to recruit, which has been covered by my colleagues on the panel, but also what we ask to take on, what we ask to carry the load of and the weight of is quite significant. And my colleagues have already mentioned the fact that we do often, though, find that we exclude those that we seek to serve and we seek to support from the very fact that we can't offer pay. And I think there's something about that we need to actually maybe underline and underscore. That's maybe the principal point of this, not that everyone should be paid, but how do we make those that are the least seen and their voice is least heard, make sure that they are absolutely at the core of it? Because I don't think it should be about seeing it as a profit, seeing it as a benefit. It should be about, are we being inclusive? Are we being diverse in our thought? And are we being clear in the challenge to ourselves as trustees, as charities? I think the reality is, though, even if we decided to go and say trustee pay is an excellent idea, the public perceptions of that would be extremely negative. I do not think that would solve the way that charities are seen, and I do not think that would also solve the issue of how charities are valued. And I think that is one of the wider issues that I actually stand very strongly on the soapbox of, is, are charities being valued truly right now? And are we valuing our trustees as well? And we have to be honest, our trustee boards can make or break the success of what we're trying to achieve. So we all work really hard to make sure that we try and get the best people. But I think ultimately we have to understand that 31% of our sector is staffed with people like ourselves who are paid to do a job, and we expect our trustees to do that. Would we also start to put the sector at risk by saying, well, those who could afford to pay can pay? For those who can't afford, well, your only chance is basically to see what you can get or not exist at all. And I think that's a big issue that really comes back to the heart of, why is it that actually we exist and what are we here to do in our society? I refer to charities as social glue, and things begin to fall apart when the glue's not there. But it's invisible, you don't see it. And so there's really important things we have to bear in mind about action, consequence, the unintended consequences of decisions that we make. I think the last thing I would just finish off with is just a couple of points about things that we could do, rather than it go straight to pay. I think to offer meaningful, genuinely meaningful expenses for those that would allow that exclusionary aspect of trustee boards to pay for childcare, to pay for travel, to pay for accommodation, to see that as something as valuable as any other budget line that we have, that would allow people that we seek to have the voice from at that table and to make them feel really welcome, is by saying, we value your time, but we can't pay you, but here's other ways that we can do that. I think we also need to continue the conversations about what is the value to our sector, what is it that we are unique in doing, and how do we not lose the reason that we exist. There is not an intention behind me saying about profit for good as a way to say we should be striving for that, but I think the expectations of us from society are becoming more challenging. So how do we start to talk about that in a more open way? Trustees are part of it, but there are so many things that we can be talking about that's about our sector. I'll hand back over to you, Debbie, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Lindsay. So there's obviously so much in there which we're not going to get through in the next 40 minutes or solve. Maybe we will solve the problem. That's what we do, right? But I think from my point of view, as someone who's been on boards for a long time and has a private sector job, so there's that kind of maybe viewing, that a little bit differently. The one thing that really stands out to me is about kind of what you said there, Lindsay, about encouraging people from places that might not be able to afford or might not have the time or couldn't make the time because of monetary restrictions, that they can't join a board. And for me, it's something that recently I've been really kind of trying to champion a lot on boards, and think, people come to us all the time to recruit diverse boards, people from marginalised groups and different sectors of society in different places, so we can really achieve that proper diversity of thought around the board table, but actually not maybe willing or able to do something different to attract those people. And I'm not saying that, we're going to be paying people massive, 50 grand salaries a year to come on a board. It's nothing like that. There's something about valuing that person's position, and looking at each one individually, because everyone's got a different story and a different background and a different reason for joining a board, which is why this conversation, I think, can go in so many different ways, because there's not one particular, it's not a cookie cutter, well, this is the same for everyone. It's completely different. But one thing I did want to come back and ask all of the panel about was really about that commercial aspect of charities. So more and more, when we're doing our recruitment at Aspen, we're asked to, especially for chief execs and all that kind of stuff, we need a commercial and we need values, we need the head and the heart together. It's charities aren't, well, charities are completely businesses, as I think John said earlier, and maybe we don't have, shareholders, we're not making something, selling it, giving the profit to a shareholder, but essentially it needs to be run like a business. Charities are worth millions of pounds, some of them, some are really small, some are huge, and bigger than most private businesses. And it's about, how do you balance that on a board level? And I think that comes back to pay as well, because something I think it's maybe Lindsay that said, in terms of valuing that and putting a figure on, it's really difficult. But if you're expecting the organisation to run like a business, but you don't have anyone on that board that understands that, or might be precluded because of money, and people don't like talking about money, do we? The third sector is not necessarily excited to talk about money and disclose payments and all that kind of stuff, which is understandable. But at the same time, I think this conversation is highlighting that actually maybe it's time to look at it a little bit differently for some groups. So Karen, I'm going to come to you first. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, Debbie, just getting my mute off. So, I mean, I've got 30 years of experience, over 30 years, getting quite old these days, of working in the charity sector. And I think when I first started, I was doing fundraising and I was working for Barnardo's, and that was my first kind of toe in the charity sector. And Barnardo's is a very complex and large organisation. But what struck me from the minute that I started in the charity sector is that charities are businesses. They're just a different type of business. And if you don't kind of make well, I used to say a profit, but the word that you like to use in the charity sector is a surplus. If you don't kind of make that surplus at the end of the year, then you're not going to be here as an organisation. So I always thought of charities as a different type of business. They're just another type of business. And so whenever I kind of moved up the ladder in organisations, I used to just think, I need to make be as profitable. I used to have my budget. I used to want to know how much I could spend, so that I could make sure that my ROI, because I did marketing as my background, so I wanted to do as much return on investment as possible. I needed to know that I covered my salary and make as much money for the organisation as possible in every single role that I did in that organisation. And as I moved further up, I wanted to make sure that all my teams made as much ROI as possible. So I always had that mindset that everything had to have that turnover of profit for the organisation. So expenditure, income, they were interlinked all the way through my career. And then as I got further up, I started to see the relationship between restricted and unrestricted funds and that complexity of the restricted and unrestricted. So I've always seen that relationship of kind of how organizations need to think of being business. And then I've sat, because I've always been, in my career, I've always done, since I joined the charity sector, I've always sat as a trustee as well as doing my executive roles, so that I could be doing service as well as doing my other bit. So I sit on boards as well, because I've always wanted to do the other side. So I think it's really important that when you're a trustee, that you have to understand the finances of the organisation, and you have to take a real interest in what's happening with the finances of the organisation. But it is difficult, and it's difficult when you're on a board to sometimes ask those questions, because sometimes the way that finances are presented is that they're not presented in a way that everybody understands. And sometimes I see it when I'm on boards that they're presented. I was actually on a board, and I was saying to myself, I actually don't really understand anything that's being presented to me about the finances of this organisation. And I thought to myself, I'm just going to pipe up and say, I don't understand. I don't understand this conversation. I had the confidence to be able to do that and hold my hand up and say, do you mind explaining that differently? Because I don't actually understand what you're telling me. But I could see around the table that there was glazed faces and nobody else had the confidence to say anything. And that was on the fault of the organisation for not actually being able to say to explain the finances properly to the trustees. It wasn't the fault of the trustees not understanding, it was the fault of the organisation for not explaining the finances properly. But that, I had the confidence to be able to hold my hand up and say, I don't understand. Could you explain that differently? So it is getting the balance right, being able to give good financial information to your board, and also to be able to explain it well and to a level that the board needs to understand. So yeah, I think that's some of the points I would make.
I think from the nods around, I think we've all been in board meetings sometimes not quite understanding what's being presented to us. I know I certainly have, and someone needs to ask the question, don't they? So, because I'm sure most other people around the table are thinking the same thing. Lindsay, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting chat as well, actually, that's happening in the group, which is really great to see, because I think the reality we've got, and it's very much to Karen's point, that expectation of performance is very much there. And I think what's been said in the chat is there's what that origin was that I was talking about versus what the reality is now. We are one of the most heavily regulated industries, if you want to refer to it as that, in the UK. The number of charity SORPs that are in place that no other SME type business in Scotland would ever have to go through, especially from that external auditory perspective. The costs involved, the amount of investment that's involved in us proving our position, improving our business excellence is quite exceptional, really, if you look at it. And I sit on another board where I'm the only charity representative, and that is not a voluntary board from the perspective of they're talking about voluntary sector, talking about business. And that reality is a very different type of conversation. That in itself allows for really natural performance conversations, accountability conversations. And I think what we haven't been able to do in the sector is we haven't been able to move the performance expectations and outcomes of charities to align with what we expect of board performance and responsibilities. And then also that connects to the pay and the outcomes. There's a lot of really interesting points. Even Anne's made a point in the chat there about that internal conflict of would you speak up and would you not not speak up because of your voluntary status and not having pay. But actually performance and those frustrations can come through heavily on boards, to Karen's point about having to raise, what are we talking about here? The reality is, though, the sector is challenged in the very, very confined boxes that we're allowed to exist in, but we are expected to behave and to be able to act in a certain way. That means actually we're sometimes in very direct conflict with the origins of our mission, the origins of why we exist in the first place. And very much you have to really, I find this as a chief exec and as a board member, it's very important, it's constantly bringing it back to not financial performance for the sake of financial performance, but actually in pursuit of the mission, in pursuit of the thing that you are there to serve. And I think that sometimes that's the bit that actually can get lost. And I think that's where the recruitment of trustees and the motivations for someone to want to serve on a board have to be really clearly understood and interrogated. Is it there because you want to learn? Is it there you want to contribute? Is it there that you want to understand and seek to understand more about things that are happening in society? Or is it for other reasons? And that can shift the dynamic on a board quite heavily. And for those who turn up for good and turn up because they want to see that excellence versus I'm here to make sure that the books are balanced. And it's that dynamic of the business conversation with the mission conversation. And I think the two must always be held as equal accountability. If one is more important than the other, then you're in danger. But I don't think that's always necessarily something that we are all having conversations about. It's almost you're learning this by osmosis. You're learning this from your peers. I don't think that's something we're all on the same page with. I wonder what John's views will be about that too.
So I think that there's a lot, obviously, in this conversation. One of the things that I'm hearing being used interchangeably is the language, are we charities, are we third sector organisations? And does that create a mindset in funders, commissioners, and create an expectation about what we give or what we don't give? And I suppose thinking about a trustee responsibility, so for example, with Fyffe, Fyffe is currently bringing in, if you look at the statutory accounts, over £1 million into Lanarkshire. So that's a big impact it's having, not only for its beneficiaries, but for the local economy. So the trustees are charged with quite a lot. So, and sometimes the concept of being business-minded, you know, that perhaps doesn't necessarily, and again, you know, language, there might be a perception that being business-minded means that people are quite brutal in the way that they approach that. So, you know, that the curiosity that we want on boards, I'm delighted you said that, because when I think back to my first role as a trustee, I was sitting there thinking, I don't want to ask a question because I feel like completely inadequate. But what I've been really fortunate as a trustee, but also as the director here in St Mary's, the chair of the board has got such a responsibility to exercise and to encourage good governance from everyone, and to encourage that curiosity. Do we get the balance right between the financial bit and the impact? And you know that they're inextricably linked, because without the financial safety or the financial well-being of the organisation becomes at risk, and I suppose that then threatens its very being and has a it carries a potential threat for those people that we seek to serve. Coming back into, you know, currently really fortunate in both being as director here, the trustees, we're very fortunate to have accountants who allow us to, or give us comfort around the numbers, but allow us to understand the numbers without that kind of technical, but that they can take care of. And that really allows us to look at what the impact of what we're doing, because the two of them are interlinked. So I think we need to be business focused, and being business focused means that there's rigour about how the organisation is performing, but that always needs to be done within the context. So what does that mean for the people and the communities that we're serving?
Great, thanks, John. Someone had actually, I've got a couple of questions that have been sent in before today's session, and one person sent me a question in to say, and it kind of follows on, if all charities had to pay trustees, if that was kind of a new law was passed, everyone had to be paid, would we attract the wrong type of people onto boards? And that's kind of what's the wrong type of person, I guess, is the first question that comes from that. But I guess what we're getting at is, are people joining for the right reasons if they're being paid? And I just wondered, just following on from what you guys have said, is that something you think is an issue or not? If it became we'll pay a day rate of this to join a board, obviously you'd hope we'd attract a wider pool of people, but would we attract the right people? Lindsay, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm laughing along here because we all network, we all talk, we all speak, and there's so many times that's come up over the years of going, can you imagine if that was the way that we did things? And I think that's the whole point, though, is sometimes we probably have to remember as a charity sector that we're a little bit more in control of managing our own destiny, and perhaps need to say, look, if we're really great solution finders to a lot of really complex societal problems, probably need to also start looking at our own complex problems and how we actually start interacting a bit differently with that. It's not that easy, I know, but actually there's a little bit of, now than letting that happen, it's what can we also go out and start to have a bit more fortitude behind. I think that there is always risk on any kind of bringing anyone together. I think there's always a challenge around diversity of opinion, not always being safe and not always creating positive outcomes. That's always a challenge. I think it's the expectation and the performance standards that you're beginning to try and set for what are really big topics, really big issues. If you look at exactly the point you were saying, Debbie, if you look at some of our largest charities across Scotland only, we have got some significant business impact going on across Scotland, larger than actually a lot of the private business SME community, which is small to medium as a traditional size of turnover in Scotland. The charity sector, the third sector, whatever, to John's very good point about that language, that has a huge contribution to make society, with charities closing or not being able to operate in the way they are, that has an impact on employment and has impact on the communities that we are serving as well, and has, to the point about COVID, about what that's bringing into that local community entirely. What I do think we sometimes feel uncomfortable about, and I find our challenges the charity sector to be uncomfortable about things quite entertaining sometimes, because we're the ones who actually bang the drum for the uncomfortable things. We talk about the things that other sectors and other people don't want to talk about. We bring solutions that are creative and completely different to, this is how we can make people feel seen and heard, cared for, when actually other sectors might not think like that, or might think differently and comes to the table in a very different way. So the reality is that I always think no matter what you set, you might bring good or bad in any form. And I think that's probably a little bit derivative to say you might have the wrong kind of person come. I think it's about setting the example and setting the expectation from the get-go. And I think John's point about the chair is pivotal. Actually, that role has a huge responsibility for setting the tone. So whether pay or no pay was there, it's also about what is the rules of the expectations for that role, and then the rules and the expectations for how this board would operate, because that is a challenge when you have 10 to 12 people who would never normally have come together in any walk of life. They come from very different backgrounds, coming together 4 times a year, maybe sometimes online. How do we create that expectation of performance when we talk about expectation of performance in our own teams, and we're working out how to do that in a hybrid way now? There's a lot of things that we probably have expectations of our boards that's too much, and we maybe don't always value them enough. but I think the value also needs to come with more honesty around performance. And that's something that I would like us to see. I, as a board member, challenge that heavily. Are you here for the right reasons? That's a big thing that we need to do.
Yeah. You want to say something there, John? You want to...
Yeah, so I think that there's a question from Andrew in the chat that maybe links really nicely to what you were saying there, Lindsay. So I suppose for me, just to go back to recruitment is risky, and Debbie is a professional in that sphere, will know that that's her bread and butter, that the appointment only goes so far. It's when the appointee lands in the role that we begin to see whether or not it's a fit. And when I'm thinking, certainly in COVID, one of the things that happens in COVID, which allows us to support, or the trustees to feel supported as well, is that there's a kind of performance review programme. And it's performance review light, you know, that where the chair of the board meets with the trustees annually just to find out, so what do you think you've contributed, and also to give some feedback about what they've contributed. And I suppose in those conversations, what is then aired is what Andrew has begun to talk about how much people are able to give, or how much people are actually given. Because, you know, while I accept the point, Andrew, I wouldn't necessarily say that the budget size of the organisation determines how much time people may need to give. You know, things happen in an organisation, complexity arises even in the smallest organisations that may require trustee involvement and significant time to be involved, because the failure to exercise their governing duties would be really, really detrimental. So at times we do need to really lean in and carry much more than we might. And it's probably, dare I say it, and it's been recorded, but as a senior leader, as a director of the service, you know, how much time do we actually are we paid for, and how much time do we devote to the organisation? I suppose that for me it falls back to that. So I'm committed to doing the best thing for St Mary's. Here's the director for the children, for the organisation. At times I will need to work additionally. As a trustee in Covey, we have our four board meetings, subgroups as well as that. So I'm committed to doing that. At times I might need to give more, at times I might need to give less. So I think for me, Andrew, just the scale of the organisation doesn't necessarily equate to the time that we might need to give.
So I've just keep coming back. We've had a couple of comments now about the size of organisations, and I guess there's something in that as well about if the organisation's not got as much money, can they afford to pay, you know, if there's something set, could they afford to pay it? And obviously the bigger ones would have more money. So that would maybe, does that mean then that, you know, those organisations will get the best trustees and other people won't if they can't afford, you know, to do that, which I think is really interesting actually, and not something that's necessarily come up before. What do you guys think about the size of organisation, and is that important, Karen, when we're looking at paying trustees?
I think sometimes it provides some advantage if you've got, because, you know, part of this is that if you're paying trustees, it's most likely going to have to come out of unrestricted funds. And to be frank about it, the larger charities are probably going to have the greater amount of unrestricted funds available and reserves available. So that's making an assumption, but smaller charities may not have those free reserves, may not have those free unrestricted funds available to make those choices, to pay trustees. And it has to be within your constitution, so it has to be something that you are able to do. You would have to check with your stakeholders, you would have to check with, and as I mentioned, your constitution, your articles of association. So all of those things. And if you've got key funders, like if you get government funding, you would have to check with your key funders that it's something you're able to do, and that they're, that it's something that they sanction for you to do. So all of those things you would need to run past, and also then your key stakeholders, because reputationally you wouldn't want to be going out to advert and for it to be seen that you're paying, and on the same token that you're still asking for funds, because these are complex things that you're then making decisions on. And you might want to be talking to people and saying why you're having to make these decisions and why you're starting to pay trustees. So the likelihood is that small organisations with small turnovers may struggle to find the funds, the free unrestricted funds to make those decisions to pay. I do want to come back to some of the things that people raised in terms of fit. And it was just, I was talking to some of the organisations that do pay, and I've talked to a couple that do pay, and they've recently done some recruitment where they have recruited board members. They call them non-execs. It's language again, do we call charity sector and third sector? I've done an article about that. So you can call them non-execs. It depends again on your what type of organization you are. So that's another thing, is your structure as an organization. But if you do have non-execs, then you can, in certain circumstances, pay. Then when they've gone out to market for their board members as non-execs, then they've found that they've attracted their high caliber, skilled individuals. They've had a huge response to their adverts. They've attracted people with really good skills and knowledge. But what they have come back to me with is that they found that they had to really test an interview the values and an alignment with values to the organization. And that's where they found that the test at interview was very interesting, because the skills and knowledge was there, but it was the actual alignment of values with the organization that they really had to test. And one of the things that they've put in place in the organizations is a really strong code of conduct for the board of trust, for the board of non-executives, and it's a very strong code of conduct. And it's also around having a very strong chair to lead that board of non-executives, that they really understand their role. And also it's also explaining very openly at the recruitment and the induction stage that there are penalties if they do not attend board meetings, because they are paid. So that there are penalties if they do not attend those board meetings. So they were some of the things that came out when I was in discussion with those organisations who do pay trustees, well, non-execs in this case. So yeah, so it was quite interesting, some of those thoughts, and just wanted to share those.
Thanks, Karen. No, that's really interesting. There's been quite a lot of discussion around the level of responsibility and accountability we have as trustees, and also the chair in particular, who, for those of us who've been chairs, know exactly what a massive responsibility that can be. And actually, sometimes it can become like a second job, depending on what's happening in that organisation. And I've been there myself, and I know exactly how that felt, and how that kind of, when you feel that level of, or that weight of the accountability on your shoulders, you think, actually, this isn't just something I turn up to every other month for a meeting. This is a real and serious thing. And what kind of, always something we try to talk about with candidates when they're going forward to apply for trustee roles is the legal responsibility. And that level of, actually the board are accountable for this, this, and this. And it's not a case of, just turning up. So I think what's really interesting is there's probably no other role that you would expect someone to have that level of accountability and not be rewarded in payment of some kind. And obviously, there are lots of reasons we all become trustees and lots of reasons, other rewards in terms of what the work that we're doing. But, is it, for someone in that chair role, for instance, is it really feasible to have someone have that amount of weight on them, who's maybe in their own job and got other things to do, and as I think John maybe said earlier, time, how much time do you really have to do that? And yes, you go through peaks and troughs and everything, but I can't think of anything else where that's the case. And essentially, if trustees are volunteers, I don't think that's what people think of when they think of as volunteering. So I guess, what do the panel think about that, in terms of the type of roles that we're looking after, the legal responsibility, and all of that stuff as well. John, I'll come to you.
So thanks, Debbie. And again, just so much. So again, just to maybe not overly focus on language. When we're talking about volunteers, I think that it creates a perception that we're doing something for nothing. And voluntary organisations, I think people, there was something in the chat that an organisation that's a voluntary organisation has got a £50 million turnover doesn't sound like a voluntary organisation. It sounds like a business. And you're absolutely right, Debbie. No other walk of life would we expect people to carry that level of responsibility without remuneration. But I suppose for me, what it does, it maybe comes back to some of the things that Karen is talking about, and the values, that kind of values-based recruitment at times can test what the motivation actually is, or indeed what the need of the organisation is. So the chairs that I've been really, really fortunate to work with, I think they would say to you that they've gone into those roles with their eyes wide open, and they expect at times, that with good governance, the organisation might be sailing, as it were, despite the challenges, the fiscal challenges. And that's that's maybe one of the reasons we're having this conversation just now, because the sector is so volatile. We're all fighting for the same pound. I would have a view that those chairs go in to this knowing what they're taking on. They're familiar with the responsibility, and actually, I suppose that makes me wonder that with that level of responsibility you're carrying, would being paid make any difference?
Thanks, John. Lindsay?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and actually is probably the kind of the challenge back to this conversation really is, does that create a difference for what we're all trying to do? I can't help but say I completely agree with everything that John has just said and the things he's put out there, but it makes me also go back to the comment that Ian has made in the chat about that scale and that size issue. The scale and the size does not equate to anything about the pressure that a chair is under, particularly if we bring it back to the chairs who don't have paid staffed organisations, that they're still trying to make sure that good things are happening in our community across Scotland. That pressure is still there, that weight is still there. I think money doesn't make the world go round unless you don't have any. And that's the sad truth about it. It's very easy to go, well, I've got the resources to be able to take chance, take risk, maybe generate something from that. But I think that when money becomes the foundational thing that you're constantly thinking about, constantly talking about, it kind of does tend to then distract from the point of everything else. And I'm very much a firm believer that charities don't have a right to exist, that they should be there to directly do and serve the thing that they are set up to do. And I don't think that weight does change between a larger organisation or a smaller. But I think the pressure of funds, the pressure and expectation of funds does shift when you don't have reserves. It does shift when you don't feel that stable. And I think that can also then shift the way that a board behaves, responds, and feels valued because of the challenges that that organisation is going through. And I would imagine that, you know, for the smaller, medium organisations that Ian's referring to, that only heightens that pressure, that only heightens that that sense of challenge for the sector. I think that the chair has an enormous role, and I think that is also something that's a really important topic. You know, you said yourself, Debbie, it's almost like, you know, it's a full-time job that you're taking on, and that almost the belief that you have to be available all the time, and that is the sole holder of the solutions as well. I think the chief exec has those same, or the managing director or the director of the charity has those same challenges. You're one person, but you're expected to hold all the pieces of string that somehow make everything work. So I think we do have a problem with the fact that if we look at the number of charities that are in a good position financially versus those that are not, maybe trustee pay isn't the real question. Maybe that's really not the thing that's going to solve our problems right now and make sure that charities are here to stay and contributing to Scotland.
Thanks, Lizzie. Karen, do you want to come in that one before we finish up?
I think there's always, Lindsay, a lot bigger questions than just pay in the you know, for trustees. You know, when you think that 40% of charities are using their reserves just to survive, then that, I think, is probably, you know, the state of the sector, and that's in Scotland. So I think, you know, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I put out there to you know, to bring to the table. But, you know, the bigger topic for me is, you know, around restricted, unrestricted funding, that big question, you know, funders funding the, you know, core funds of organisations, charities not having to use their reserves to prop themselves up. You know, that for me is the age-old question. Should charities kind of think about partnerships and merging? Are there too many charities? You know, these are all the big questions that are always out there on the table, and that we could have big discussions and big debates on. So pay is quite a small issue for us to be discussing, but I think also an important one, because it raises the issues of equality, it raises the issues of diversity, and it also talks about all of the big topics around the important things about what trustees do, what the chairs do, and the important thing about the amount of the importance of those roles that we have as charities, and the importance of trustees in the charity sector. So I think it's raised a lot more than just pay, and I think that's the important thing that we should take away from this discussion as well. Pay is just a little part of it. So I think we've had some really important key messages that have come out of today, and I think it's been really valuable.
So I think the real thing is we need to have about 10 more sessions on about on all of these things, because we can't cover everything in an hour, and that's been the quickest hour ever imaginable.
Absolutely.
So Peter, I just seen your question there. I want to answer it before we go, is that there's no real kind of typical time commitment. I guess it depends what you're doing, what's happening in the charity at that point. Sometimes you're going to be doing a lot more than others, but if you want to pick up on that a little bit more, we can get in touch with you after the session's finished. So thank you so much to everyone for their questions, of course, to John, Karen and Lindsay for being excellent panelists and sharing all your thoughts or some of the thoughts on that stuff. And no doubt we'll pick it up again in the future. So thanks very much, and we'll get something else scheduled in soon to carry the debate on.